Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar named as the Turning Tides of Maritime Compliance Lessons from last year, Outlook for this year. It's great to see such strong interest in this topic, which continues to evolve rapidly and impact the maritime and commodity markets in very real ways, as we are seeing right now. Over the past year, we can say confidently that 2025 has been a defining period for maritime compliance, from sanctions enforcement and regulatory expectations to how risk is identified, monitored, and in sometimes disrupted. Today, we will reflect on the key lessons from last year, what worked, what didn't, and most importantly, what we should be watching as we move into next year, into 2026. For those who might not be familiar with us, Kpler provides intelligence and data analytics across global trades, commodities, and maritime markets, helping real organizations make informed, compliant decisions. Together with Marine Traffic, which delivers real-time vessel tracking and maritime intelligence, we support compliance, risk, and operational teams with visibility, transparency, and actionable insights across the maritime ecosystem. I am very pleased to be joined today by two colleagues from our risk and compliance team. First, we do have Anna Subasic, trade risk analyst, who brings deep expertise in trade risk, sanctions analysis, and regulatory developments. And of course, our own Wan Li, our junior risk and compliance analyst, who works closely on risk assessments and compliance monitoring, and will be sharing some practical insights from her work. I'm looking forward to the perspectives they will bring into our table today, and I think that our conversation will be extremely interesting. We also leave some time at the very end of the webinar for our Q&A session, so feel free as we go through the presentation to drop your questions or your thoughts in the chat. We will collect them at the end and address as many as possible as we can. So let's start. So at the beginning, in order to set the stage as we enter 2026, we are already seeing a strong enforcement tone. From high-profile US seizures like the Marinera case that we have seen just a few days ago, to increasingly coordinated action between the UK and France around the Mediterranean. So, Anna, what do these developments tell us about how seriously maritime compliance is being treated going into the new year?
Yes, I think the first weeks of 2026 have set a very sharp tone for sanctions, compliance, and risk. And enforcement has been basically moving decisively from policy into practice. You have many parallel centers of interest at play, and each have their own story, basically. For example, Venezuela has returned to the top of the risk agenda as oil sanctions have enforced through complete, naval blockades, vessel seizures, and coordinated international action against shadow shipping and all kinds of financing networks. More and more control is exercised over the crude oil in the country. For example, we're effectively seeing Petróleos de Venezuela in commercial limbo, which is legally still exporting and placing volumes in Caribbean storage under, major U.S. connected trading houses in an effort that is supervised by the U.S. government in order to stabilize and kind of refill the reserves in the country. But then in parallel, we also see some key political caveats that are happening in places like Russia and Iran. For example, the unrest in Iran has coincided with tighter sanctions on oil transport and on the facilitators themselves, which has been reinforcing this link between political instability, human rights risk, and general sanctions exposure, I would say. So at this point, I think exports are at a critical crossroads between, the US is buckling down, but at the same time, China is assessing what needs to happen post the kind of supply overhang that we're seeing. And then I would also say more broadly, I think we're also moving towards a much more kinetic phase of enforcement. So I think this is translating into like faster moving geographical risk, real asset disruption that we're seeing rather than just a theoretical exposure. And just a general need, I would say, to treat shipping and trade finance and counterparties as all being primary risk points.
Mm.
All in all, I think the main point here is that we are in for quite a ride this year. And at the forefront of it is how prepared the market will actually be to deal with this upcoming volatility and risk, which is why we think that, this webinar comes at a perfect time to kind of examine these questions, basically.
Yeah, and it's definitely as yours mentioned how the market is able to be adapted. Beyond
Mhm.
oil, we are seeing other commodities increasingly gaining momentum right now in shadow trades. And at the
Mm.
same time, Europe is at a crossroads with Russian gas, with 2026 this year shaping up to be the final year of importing Russian LNG. How do you see this shifting the compliance and risk landscape for LNG specifically and related trades?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think while we know that like crude markets are generally the primary drivers of shadow trade, the past year has also been highlighting the kind of practical limits of sanctions on Russia's energy sector in general. And this has been evident through the continued imports of Russian LNG into Europe. Even if there's plans in place, as you mentioned, to like phase those imports out by September 2027. But rather than an immediate cutoff, I think the strategy is more focused on a long-term diversification towards more reliable trade partners such as
Hmm.
Qatar. So pipeline gas to Europe has largely collapsed, but then LNG continued to reach these global markets, including, parts of Europe. And that's not because it's only not comprehensively sanctioned, but it's also locked in terms of long-term contracts, and it's difficult to replace in the short term because of that. And I would say as a result of this, I think Russian LNG has often been, legally permissible, but then at the
Hmm.
same time still quite politically contentious. So I think forcing buyers, ports, and financiers to kind of manage growing this reputational and compliance risk in the absence of, formal prohibitions. But the broader lesson overall is that the global commodity trade is rarely gonna, just stop altogether. It's going to reroute. So I think with that in mind, actually, before we turn into our like key risk and compliance themes for
Hmm.
2026, I think it's worth briefly mentioning on the actual lessons that we have seen in 2025. So that's definitely going to help us set the stage for the trends that we're seeing right now. So I think with that, why don't we pass it over to our colleague Yuan, who will walk us through a rundown of the past year. So Yuan, the floor is yours.
Yep, thank you, Anna. So before we talk specifically about what happened in 2025, I do want to take a step back and show the scale of the sanction landscapes we are operating in today. So on the left, you are looking at the trend on sanctioned vessels. In December 2020, we have just under 400 sanctioned vessels, and by December 2025, that number actually increased to over 1,800, which is a 373% increase over just 5 years. And on the right, for the companies, we actually see an even steeper increasing trend, with over 600% increase in 5 years, although from a smaller starting point. And now, if we look at the month-on-month changes for both the sanctioned vessels and companies, you will notice sharp spikes followed by pauses. And this goes to show that sanctions actually didn't just tighten gradually, but instead they are being rolled out in concentrated ways. And 2025 is a year that really illustrates this dynamic. It was a year of enforcement driven by waves from the US, the EU, and the UK, which leads us to our next slide. Next slide, please. So the table over here gives you an overview of the main regulatory waves we saw in 2025. And what stands out first is that sanctions actually came in three major waves, in January, in May, and in October. And the oil price cap update in July also helped to strengthen the second wave we see in May. And at a high level, these measures focus on Russia and Iran-linked trade, where we do see a strong emphasis on the shadow fleet as well as the network supporting it, especially near the key transshipment hubs. And what we also see is that regulators are starting to target how circumventions happen. So, for example, through AIS manipulation or opaque ownership structures. And as a result, we do see restrictions begin to extend into the other sectors as well, including insurance, service provision, and even LNG linked trade. So that's about the enforcement backdrop for 2025. And in the next slide, we shall see how this played out in the data. So the graph in this slide shows how the enforcement waves translated into the vessels designations each month. And just a quick note here that the bars show vessels added to the sanction list for the first time. Looking at January, for example, while the OFAC announced sanctions covering over 180 shadow fleet tankers, only 142 of those were new additions. And we also do see a similar pattern later in the year around the EU's 17th to 19th sanction package, whereby the large regulatory waves directly translated into those sharp monthly increases we see over here. And taken all together, we have over 700 first-time vessel designations in 2025 alone, which is roughly about 77% higher than that in 2024. So this really highlights the scale of enforcement during the year. And since sanctions are increasingly targeting the shadow fleet, I think it would be good for us to look at the key trend and also to clarify what exactly we mean by shadow fleet. So at Kpler, a shadow fleet vessels have to meet at least two conditions. Firstly, it has carried sanctioned cargo, and second, it shows at least one additional risk indicators from the 7 listed here. And put them in simple terms, we are mainly talking about a group of aging vessels that are operating without proper classification, without insurance coverage, and often utilizing deceptive shipping practices to move those sanctioned cargo. And as of today, we have detected more than 3,300 active shadow vessels globally. And we see around 30 vessels per month joining the shadow fleet as well. However, looking at the graph, we actually do see a decrease in the number of shadow vessels in 2025, a 6% decrease to be exact. And this was actually a direct result from the enforcement waves that we saw earlier on, with more shadow vessels being identified and formally sanctioned. And this decline might look like a positive sign at first, but in reality, the shadow fleet has proven itself to be much more resilient than that. So instead of disappearing, they are actually adapting and increasingly relying on the deceptive shipping practices to keep the sanctioned trade moving. And this then brings us to our next slide. So now if we look at the chart on the left, it shows how these deceptive behaviors have evolved over the past 18 months. And if you observe closely, these spikes are actually not random. They align closely with the major enforcement waves that we have discussed earlier on, especially around May, July, and October. So for example, in May, AIS spoofing have surged to more than 200 cases, and at the same time, dark SDS also do hit a record high level with over 300 cases. And this again goes to show how the enforcement and deceptive behavior move hand in hand. The deceptive behaviors are also becoming essential to how the shadow fleet vessels keeps the millions of sanctioned barrels moving despite under tighter enforcement. And interestingly, our behavioral analytics actually revealed that these practices, together with frequent reflagging, are actually some of the consistent patterns that surface weeks or even months before a vessel gets sanctioned, meaning that they are acting as a reliable early indicators of sanctions. So this turned our compliance landscape from reactive to predictive in the year of 2026. And now moving to the right-hand side graph, we actually do see a similar story that even with much stronger enforcement in 2025, our overall trade flows from the key sanctioned suppliers remain broadly stable year on year. And in fact, it even grew slightly in places like Iran and in Venezuela. So enforcement didn't fully disrupt these flows, and instead it just changed how they move globally. And also note that these charts include only commodities that are primarily targeted by sanctioned entities. So, well, it seems like the shadow trade has re-established its position in 2025. Now we shall take a look at what is ahead in 2026. So, passing the ball over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll be discussing our forward-looking view as well. So let's start by giving a policy outlook, and we'll also give a in-depth look at the logistics, as well as some of the predictive risk that we're looking at with Kepler RNC. And then finally, we'll finish up with topics to watch. So I think, first of all, as was the case for 2025, as Yuan mentioned already, we believe that illicit trade practices are likely to keep evolving. And that's going to keep adding the pressure that we've been seeing to oil and gas market balances, but also heightening some of the price risks, and then finally also increasing exposure to environmental incidents as well. And most of this is attributed to policy volatility. So sanctions volatility in 2026 will not be determined by a single factor. Instead, as always, it's an interplay of many different things. So going to be ranging between geopolitical developments all the way to market reactions. So markets should therefore expect a sustained unpredictability in both regulatory actions and also their economic impacts as well. So I think this chart that we're showing you here is a good representation of why sanctions volatility has become a structural feature of the oil market rather than just like a temporary disruption. So pay attention to the crude oil on water levels here that are reaching an all-time high in January 2026. So close to 400 million barrels in transit. And those are being driven disproportionately by sanctioned origins, so the likes of, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. And the key point here is not just the volume, but what that volume actually represents. So elevated crude on water is basically showing us that there is this growing disconnect between sustained upstream loading and increasingly uneven or delayed import demand under these sanctioned regimes. Because as enforcement is tightening and compliance expectations are different across different jurisdictions, basically we're seeing barrels spending longer times in transit, being rerouted, or they're being also stored offshore, just waiting for a viable discharge opportunity. And I think the accumulation here is driven by both demand and supply side factors. So on the demand side, we, for example, have a case of India constraining purchases of Western Russian crude, while China is also slowing the lifting of Iranian and Venezuelan cargoes. But then on the supply side, for example, Russia has obviously kept its regular loading pace despite some of the persistent attacks that we have been seeing on key energy infrastructure. So that's also contributing to this supply overhang that we're seeing. And I would say together, these forces underscore how, sanctions volatility is no longer just a compliance issue, but also a structural driver, basically, of physical market dislocations. So,
Anna, sorry to interrupt, but as
yeah.
we were seeing that specific graph with the different countries and the different origins of these commodities coming on the water, I was thinking about the different approaches that the regulators are facing and are having on their hands in order to disrupt these flows. Did you see something specific within this year?
Yes, I think generally, if we're talking about the differences in enforcement style, we believe that the United States continues to be the primary driver of sanctions
Hmm.
enforcement. And, critically, it's also the main source of unpredictability. We know that there's a lot of US political dynamics that are increasingly shaping both the frequency and the direction of new and existing measures. So this is true both for a reduction and an escalation of sanctions. But then at the same time, market participants, particularly like in oil and gas, tend to prioritize more short-term flow stability over longer-term compliance optimization, which then reflects like a persistent supply concern. And in contrast to that, I would say just to touch on the Europe side of things as well, because I think Europe is moving towards a more harmonized and like increasingly stringent regulatory framework that is showing us that some of the early signals are already visible from joint efforts seen as the efforts that we've been seeing from France and the UK. And this enforcement is basically tightening across some of the key markets. So, in response to that, illicit trade practices are also evolving, and that continues to add this pressure that we mentioned to oil and gas market balances. But basically, sanctions volatility is feeding this dynamic. So, market participants are responding by prioritizing physical flow over efficiency, and that pushes barrels basically onto the water, then into destination markets. And this is why you see this rise in Russian, Iranian, Venezuelan crude. But it also highlights, as you well know, Demetrius, that sanctions do not necessarily remove this supply, but they instead distort the kind of logistics that we're seeing. So, in that sense, just going back to the slide, I think the key message here is that the record levels of crude on water that we're seeing in January is actually a physical manifestation of sanctions volatility. So it's not just the geopolitical tension, but it's the market's adaptation to this enforcement, evolving evasion tactics, and the shifting behavior that we're seeing from buyers. And as long as this sanctions policy remains politically driven and also unevenly enforced, that basically means we're still going to see elevated crude inventories on water that are likely to persist, reinforcing this volatility that we're seeing in markets. So I think with that, now we can maybe move on to talk about the logistical trends for 2026 and the actual state of the shadow fleet itself. So this is another important highlight, how the shadow fleet is actually continuing to demonstrate this operational resilience that we've already been seeing in 2025, even as enforcement is increasing. So what is changing is actually not the fleet size, but instead it's the fleet behavior. As Yuan mentioned, we do not expect to see the shadow fleet growing like we didn't see it in 2025. The same thing goes for 2026. Instead, we're seeing an increasingly layered and sophisticated diversion tactic. So this chart over here is showing a high risk ship to ship or SDS activity across a smaller number of key hubs. So you have locations such as Damietta in Egypt, the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus, and so on. They don't only stand out for the number of high risk SDS events, but they also kind of stand out for the relatively limited number of vessels that are involved. And this chart is showing you that there is higher utilization rates per vessel year to date, and then there are also more repeated coordinated operations rather than just a broader fleet expansion. Note here that the EOPL actually stands for Eastern Outside Port Limit. So this is a zone offshore Malaysia where we tag SDS operations that our algorithm is sometimes not able to pick up or automatically identify the other vessels that are involved. But when it comes to the operational logistics here, I think another trend that I need to mention is that we've been noticing over the past few months, there are operators that are relying more heavily on loitering behavior as well. So on top of that, repeated STS transfer after having initial STS events and then having multiple leg routing as well to kind of all in the effort to obscure cargo ownership and origin. So these hubs are basically functioning as these pressure points for logistics. They're allowing barrels to be blended and redistributed basically without having direct entry into major importing ports. And you'll notice also that this activity is shifting a bit geographically. So there is also the prominence of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern hubs that reflects a move away from this traditional high visibility chokehold towards jurisdictions that are a bit more, let's just say, complex enforcement environments, or that just have a higher tolerance for ambiguity in general. And at the same time, the persistence of these hubs indicates that there are these diversion pathways that are becoming more entrenched rather than just temporary. So all of this to say, I think the key takeaway here would be that our data, our Kpler data, reinforces this view that we have that sanctions enforcement is actually driving operational complexity rather than removing volumes outright. And in 2026, this kind of trend is manifesting through opaque logistics rather than just a simple expansion of the fleet itself, I would say. So I think from here we can maybe move on to talk about another key piece of trade logistics in 2026, and that is, of course, the the trading structure side of things. So that's another piece of the puzzle, as we have been seeing a lot of non-traditional intermediaries acting as new sellers of sanctioned product, particularly when it comes to Russian crude. They have continued to gain traditional market share by offering commercial terms that traditional trading houses cannot match under current sanctions and under price cap regimes. And this, they have like a competitive edge because it's not only about scale, it's also about flexibility. They're able to discount prices to accommodate any kinds of delayed or rerouted cargoes. They're able to arrange financing that's outside of the price cap, so primarily through regional banks. They're able to also tolerate the non-standard routes that we have been seeing and kind of extended laycans. So they offer flexible payment arrangements, and that's something that's particularly attractive to Asian refiners, for example. And I would say that this flexibility is being delivered through a small number of reoccurring intermediary structures that we have kind of observed at Kpler Risk and Compliance. So if you take a look to the left here, you see that there is a first structure as an offshore special purpose vehicle that often has nominee arrangements. So these SPVs are very commonly registered in the so-called free zones, so the UAE, Hong Kong, sometimes even Turkey, and they typically feature nominee shareholders that will mask who the beneficial owner is. You usually have ownership that is linked to former trading desks or their logistical firms. So while equity is still at a minimum and corporate life cycles are kind of short, they're often very aligned with quite specific trade windows. So these will provide legal insulation and they can begin lifting cargoes within weeks of incorporation. So that's a lot of the ways that Russian shadow trade functions these days. And then, for example, another popular structure that we might see is a more logistics integrated trading arm. So in several cases as well, we see that tankers and operators will have established parallel trading companies in separate offshore jurisdictions. So this integration will then allow operators to manage sanctions and manage shipping and the pricing risk as well within one single commercial framework. So that comes in very handy. And then I would highlight a third category that consists of more producer adjacent private firms. And these are legally independent entities that are linked to formal commercial staff. So while they formally separate from producers, they still have a sort of proximity that allows them to have an access to allocations, to operational insight, and it enables them to have an immediate sanctioned flow incoming while maintaining like a degree of legal separation. I would say all of this is to say that when these are taken together, these are intermediary models that are becoming a central feature of sanctioned oil trade in 2026. So it's not that enforcement is likely to entrench their role, it's also that the increasing opaque structures that we're seeing in trade flows and the shifting compliance that is going away from producers and towards intermediaries is kind of at the helm of the trade logistics that we're seeing for 2026 as well. So I would say we can talk a little bit more now about actual predictive capabilities when it comes to these vessels in the shadow fleet. So it's definitely not enough to keep monitoring vessels that are under high risk and tracking new designations as they happen in 2026. Instead, you need to be able to assess who the next candidate is likely for sanctioning or where the next designation lies. And market participants have a need for this in many, many different capacities. And so this slide, for example, shows how this predictive risk scoring can change sanctions compliance by using our in-house proprietary risk scoring method. Since we've launched this forward-looking method in Q4 of last year, I think we've seen more than 50 high-risk vessels from our list that have actually been designated. So this is reaffirming to us that there are specific kinds of behaviors that will lead to designations. So basically, at the moment, for 2026, we have identified around 244 vessels that are at varying risk of sanctioning in 2026. And this is based on accumulated behavioral signals rather than just having like an isolated incident. So we consistently observe that there's a three-phase escalation pattern that we are able to detect well before any kind of regulatory action actually happens. So the timeline on the left here is showing this pattern. For example, for a vessel called Aquarius, over the 12 months in 2025, our analytics have flagged that there has been early port exposure and IS anomalies as well, and this is tracked its escalation through repeated STS events and then sanction liftings, which then ended up peaking actually with dark activity around Karg Island and continuous crude movements, spoofing in Indonesia, and then finally you can see there is a detention as well that happened in Dalian. So OFAC ended up designating this vessel as a consequence of these events on the 20th of November in 2025, after this full escalation was already quite visible in the data. So usually, phase one of this is the emerging phase. Phase two is usually the operational escalation that we're seeing. And then I would say phase three is the kind of peak illicit activity and finally the enforcement alignment that we are also seeing here.
Okay, Anna,
Yes.
as you mentioned the three phases, because we constantly speaking and we're talking about the three shifts that define this transition into the predictive intelligence. Can you tell us more about this, about how you do approach that specific thing?
Yeah, so we often talk about, besides these escalation shifts, there's also three shifts that define like a transition into predictive intelligence. So it's the fact that regulators are no longer focused on individual ships, but on entire networks across, brokers and facilitation that
Mm.
comes with insureds and managers and intermediaries as well. So we have real-time compliance data that is becoming like a commercial differentiator, actually, because traders, charters, and banks are adopting, integrated risk that then is like feeding in to prevent any kind of operational or financial disruption. So I would say that there is a real need to have these transparency tools to flag, the different risk layers, but also use, our dashboards that we put together,
Mhm.
APIs, any kind of like automated attestations that we have they're essentially helping to build into like a risk system that insurance and classification societies can also use to then reduce exposure to any kind of high risk tonnage. So this is what I would say is
Yeah.
basically defining this transitional risk. And so, I think the main takeaway here for 2026 is that sanctions risk will be increasingly defined by detectable escalation patterns that we're able to observe. So it's not down anymore to any surprise designations. We're very much able to tell who is next on the sanctioning line. And so I would say, moving on from that, maybe we can move on to talk about some of the topics to watch out for. And at this point, I think I've been talking quite a lot, so maybe let's open it up for a bit more discussion.
Yeah, of course. So I think that the main concern for everyone within this webinar and across the industry right now is the Venezuela.
Mhm.
So, and we have had some series of webinars earlier this year about Venezuela, after Maduro, and all the rest.
Mm.
So the main question is, what we are seeing in Venezuela at the moment, and do you think that crude loadings continuing over there, and what we can expect on the coming days?
So flows have definitely stabilized,
Mm,
especially those to the US, and this has happened at the very beginning of the year. So they're quite normalized, and we are seeing some legitimate loadings, if you can call
mm,
them that, because they are happening under the supervision of the US government. So we flag these as green kind of loadings without too much risk. There's at least two, I think, recently that we can confirm are a part of this general initiative to have a swap that is
mm,
basically aimed to refill the SPR, aka the reserves in Venezuela, which is helping, as a part of the economic rebound plan. But we're also at the same time still detecting some satellite confirmed dark activity.
mhm,
So it's quite a mixed bag.
yeah.
Um, Venezuelan oil reliance is like essentially going around workaround channels. It's like deep discounts, it's SCS transfers, and the main buyer is China. So we do think that in terms of the buying activity, it's likely going to keep going to the US, and China will have to pause liftings
Mm,
until at least the PDFCA has more clarity around the actual authority and the payment channels that are clarified, that need to be clarified in the near term. And then I would also say, because we are seeing the oil control um, under an indefinite duration by the US at the moment, or at least, as Trump said, until we see new elections coming into place. I think it's safe to say that in the midterm, we might see actually some relaxation from the US side of things. If these loadings continue and new elections are in line with what the
mm,
current government's wishes are as well. Um, and then maybe I should just mention on the shadow fleet side of things as well. There was a notable number of vessels right away after Maduro's capture that essentially scattered away from
yeah.
anchorages and from like the key points, the loading terminals and so on that have been now subject to seizures as well. And those are likely to continue if they actually follow a certain pattern that
Mhm.
we are now able to identify, Demetrius. So I was thinking maybe you would want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about like the seizure patterns that we're seeing, for example, the Veronica case or anything like that.
Oh, we just changed roles then. Okay.
Mhm.
So yeah, indeed, this is something that attracts a lot of attention to many of our clients. So basically, our risk assessment was on the repeated patterns that we were able to identify for these vessels based on the past US seizures, and of course, based on the past US sanctions that they were placing, and they were focusing on the Venezuelan leaked vessels. So by monitoring at the very first place the ice behavior, like the ice gaps, the high risk ice gaps, or even the smaller ones, and of course the spoofing, which is a huge red flag for everyone. And the operational passes when the vessel is idling or when the vessel is loitering around without anything, with any active business over there. And at the very end, the exposure to the sanctioned trades. If the vessel at the very end has been loaded, either through port call or through ship-to-ship transfers, any sanctioned cargo, either from Venezuela, but in many places we have seen that these vessels were been engaging with other sanctioned trades like Iran or even like Russia. So by
Mhm.
combining all these together, it would be possible to identify that the Veronica, that vessel, was starting to have a similar pattern of activity based on the ACE data that we were receiving out of Venezuela. And we were able to, on the spot, to identify that these vessels probably on the spotlight from the US folks in order to make these the last sizer that we have seen over there.
Yeah, this is a very important, I would say, analysis that
Yeah.
we highlight and actually wrote a market pulse about that. So,
Mm.
yeah, great place to mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we have covered a lot about the crude oil and in general about Venezuela. So we can move our discussion into something else, and especially around Europe and in regards to the LNG and the next things that we will be seeing from the next year. What do we expect for the Indian refineries, for example, breaking product to Europe in 2026? We are having a specific restriction right now for these refineries. And we already have a lot of attention from our clients to help them to understand and identify these
Mhm.
refineries in advance.
Yeah. So this is more of again, a crude, heavy question, I would say. And you might have been following the announcement that there's been a deal done called the mother of all deals recently between India and the EU. And this is a deal that essentially is going to double EU goods exports to India, I think by 2032. But in the meanwhile, it's pretty obvious still that Russian barrels remain very economically competitive. And they remain also quite well suited to India's refining system. And, while the main refineries have been washed out, volumes are actually expected to recover from this month onward because trade is going to be shifting to
Mhm.
the non-designed intermediaries that we talked about. So, unless we see an actual broader secondary sanction implementation with more responsibility shifted to away from India and actually on the European Union member states, I would say that it's very tough to enforce
Mhm.
at the moment. And so Russian crude is likely going to remain, I think, a very structurally embedded flow into India's
Mhm.
slate. So
Yeah.
this overall ties into the general bigger problem that we have of missing barrels in the market and actually
Mhm.
makes it quite prominent. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we wrap it up and go directly to the questions, just one thing that I have on my mind. As I was browsing to the web, just before the webinar, I was seeing on the X some tweets from President Trump
Mhm.
about mobilizing Armada and making or even trying to make a deal with Iran. What do you think would be the outcome of that, and what would be the connection with the sanctions?
Mhm. Yeah, I think at this point there's a new tweet every day, right?
Yeah.
But I think in the long term, when we talk about Iran and sanctions regime, there's three, I would say, plausible outcomes. So the first one would be that indeed there's like a deal that is struck that lowers the immediate tensions, but then leaves the regime intact, and then the sanctions largely in place. So then that would be resulting in a more limited relief. And I think it would also mean some continued heavy compliance risk coming out of Iran. That's one outcome. And then I think a second option, again, like we're not here to speculate about political outcomes, but
Of course.
if there is a political change, right? If there is a more gradual easing that would emerge out of this political change, if we indeed see some credible democratic elections, that does open the door to a more wider engagement with Iranian flows. So that's going to be allowing trade to expand cautiously, but still under like a managed rollback of these
Mm.
sanctions as well. So I think that's another key outcome that we would be on the lookout for. And then I think a third possible outcome is like a prolonged conflict.
Mhm.
If we see that there is a broader like enforcement on both sides, but specifically the U.S. kind of hardens down, that would be triggering an even tighter regime that we're seeing right now with broader secondary enforcement and also more aggressive like pressure both on the financial side but also on the maritime side of things. So I think for now the trajectory remains quite unstable. and there's policy signals that are oscillating between this like conditional engagement and then also coercion. So I guess we'll need to follow the tweets and the underlying signals.
One thing I do know for sure that if we were having the same discussion in 2 days, probably we will be having a completely different chat.
Totally.
So by saying that, we can open the discussion with our people over here. So please come with your questions in order to try to give timely response. So let me open up the Q&A function and see what we do have already here. So I can see a question about the shadow fleet decline that we have presented previously, and of course the sanctioned cargo element, and if we do have cleared out this by price cap compliance and or P&I coverage clearance as well. So within our logic, as we have seen before with the sanctioned cargo is the first element. It's the most critical pillar that we do have on the shadow fleet. However, in order to characterize a vessel as a shadow, it is mandatory to be connected at least with one more criteria of risks, like the missing information about the ISA manager, the missing information or the absence of coverage from a P&I club, which is included on the international group for P&I clubs, or at the same time, a deceptive shipping practices. All of them together and individually at the same time, they're breaching the regulations about the oil price cap. So whenever we see this combination of risks, it means that this vessel is breaching the price cap, and therefore we're talking about a shadow vessel. So that this is more or less our logic. So at the very end, if we do have a vessel loaded cargo from Novorossiysk, let's say, and is following all the regulations about the oil price cap, we are speaking about a totally fine trade. So let's go on another question. With such a heavy focus on tankers, oil, and LNG, what risk does Kpler see in bulk carrier destinations? Yeah, indeed. I think that this is not only on Kpler. This is not a Kpler thing. We are seeing in general within the sanctions market, the heavy focus to be placed on the oil market, on the LNG market, and seller in the energy market. So this is the focus that has been placed from the regulators. So that's why the whole industry is speaking about these specific factors. And as we are progressing, I do feel that as we are trying, as the West alliers, trying to redesignate it, the whole industry market, the whole connections that we are seeing on our landscape, we will be seeing probably more sanctions on dry market, along with other like the container ships. Quite recently, we have seen some vessels coming from Russia to be designated from the EU members and have been sanctioned within the Q4 of last year. So I think that we are just in front of seeing these sanctions entering new markets like the dry market as well. And of course, at this point of time, we do have sanctions on commodities that can be connected with the dry market, like the coal, like the Russian coal, and the same applies for Iran and for other markets as well. So the legislation's over there. The only thing, and this is what always I'm just discussing with everyone, is that when we're talking about sanctions, we're talking about the outcome of political decisions. So we're just here to analyze the behaviors. We are not capable of predicting the political decisions. And we do have, as I can see, another question about some drones attack that we have seen in the Black Sea, and I think that we have seen one or two on the Mediterranean Sea as well, about two legal tankers transporting oil in the Black Sea. And if we do foresee more extended or purposeful targeting of legal shipping operations in the future, and what are own insights into the maritime insurance for next year, for this year, more or less. So first of all, I do want to say, and I don't want to share my personal belief that whenever we do speak about putting on the target commercial vessels, this is something which is extremely dangerous. We're speaking about vessels either laden or empty or loaded. We're talking about vessels that are carrying oil, that are carrying commodities, and we are speaking about vessels that are having people over there, and they are having just citizens. So targeting citizens, as we do know, this is something which is extremely dangerous. And at the same time, we do have circumstances by having these attacks of having oil spills in the open sea, or to have either more dangerous cases over there. So I think that we have to be extremely careful for these cases. And when we are speaking about these specific tankers, we are, if I'm not mistaken, from the things that I have already seen, we were speaking about vessels that we were targeting to load CPC from Kazakhstan. So we're not talking about a sanctioned trade or something which is under specific restrictions. So I am not really capable of speaking if this is on purpose or not. But of course, as we were speaking about Black Sea, we're speaking about a place that we are having military operations just nearby. So that's why we do have an increase in P&A coverage premiums over there. And this is the same. It is the same discussion in other places like Venezuela, like the Middle Gulf. So whenever we are having these tensions, these disrupt the normal flows. And as we have seen with these two tankers just a few days ago, it disrupt even the legal flows as well. So by saying that, I can say that we can probably we can wrap it up. For everyone that would be here, I want to clearly say a huge thank you to both Juan and Anna. Your contributions were massive over here. And of course, to all the participants, after this webinar, you will be receiving a form to say if you want to continue our discussion about all these matters with me, Anna and Juan. And on the later stage, you will be receiving our video on your email, so you will be able to see it again and understand what we were speaking about with our two huge brains over here. So from our side, it was our privilege to have you here. Thank you again, and till the next time, stay safe.